The dust from the California plains settled on Zachary Zane's boots as he rode into what remained of the abandoned mining camp just outside Panamint, and the first thing he noticed was a woman sitting cross-legged in the dirt, holding an empty tin can up to the afternoon sun like it was a piece of fine crystal. It was 1882, and Zachary had seen plenty of strange things in his 32 years as a ranch hand and occasional tracker, but something about this particular scene made him pull his horse to a stop and just watch her for a moment. She was thin, far too thin, with dark hair that hung in tangled waves past her shoulders, and her dress looked like it had once been a decent calico print before the desert had bleached and shredded it into something barely holding together. He dismounted slowly, not wanting to startle her, but she did not look up even as his boots crunched through the scattered debris of the old camp. There were empty cans everywhere, dozens of them, rusted and forgotten. And as he got closer, he realized she was reading the faded labels on each one before setting it down carefully and reaching for another. "Madam?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, dried out from 3 days of riding through territory that seemed determined to suck every drop of moisture from a man's throat. She finally looked up, and he found himself staring into eyes so pale green they were almost gray, set in a face that might have been beautiful if it were not so gaunt and shadowed with exhaustion. She held up the can she had been examining, a rusted thing that had once held peaches according to the barely visible label. "I'm remembering what full felt like," she said, and her voice was surprisingly steady, though quiet. "When you read what was inside, you can almost taste it again. Peaches and syrup, condensed milk, beans with pork fat." She set the can down with the others, arranged in a neat line like soldiers. "It helps." Zachary felt something twist in his chest, a combination of pity and anger at whatever circumstances had brought a woman to this state. He crouched down, careful to keep a respectful distance, and pulled his canteen from his belt. "I have water and jerky. It is not much, but it is real." She looked at the canteen like it might be a mirage, her tongue darting out to wet, cracked lips. "Why would you share with a stranger?" "Because leaving you here to read labels on empty cans would make me a poor excuse for a human being." He held the canteen closer. "My name is Zachary Zane. Most people call me Zach. I work a cattle ranch about 15 miles south of here, and I was tracking a lost steer when I found this place." She reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she took the canteen. She drank carefully. Just small sips, like someone who had learned the hard way what happened when you gulped water on an empty stomach. "Grace Jensen," she said between sips. "I was heading to Panamint with my father and brother. We were supposed to start over there. Father heard there was work in the mines." The past tense in her words told Zachary everything he needed to know, but he asked anyway. "Where are they now?" "Dead." She said it matter-of-factly, but her hands tightened on the canteen. "We ran into trouble about a week ago. Raiders. They wanted our wagon and supplies. My father tried to fight them off." She paused, taking another careful sip. "My brother was only 16. He tried to help." Her voice cracked on that last word, and she stopped talking, her jaw clenching with the effort of holding back tears. Zachary waited, giving her time. The sun was starting to sink lower on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if the circumstances had been different. Around them, the abandoned mining camp creaked and groaned in the slight breeze, buildings half collapsed and picked clean by scavengers. "They took everything," Grace continued after a long moment. "The wagon, the horses, all our supplies. They left me alive because—" She trailed off, looking down at her hands. "One of them wanted to take me with them. The others argued it would slow them down. While they were arguing, I ran. I had been in this camp before, hiding under debris and hoping they would not find me. By the time they gave up looking, it was dark. They left, and I have been here ever since. That was 4 days ago." 4 days without food or water? Zachary could not keep the shock from his voice. "There was a little water collected in one of the troughs after the last rain. It ran out yesterday." She gestured at the cans around her. I found these scattered all over. I started reading the labels to distract myself from the hunger. Then I realized it actually helped. If you remember hard enough what peaches taste like, what beef stew smells like cooking, your mind almost believes you are eating it. Zachary stood up and went back to his horse, pulling a cloth-wrapped package from his saddlebag. He returned and unwrapped it to reveal jerky, a hunk of hard cheese, and some biscuits his boss's wife had packed for him. "You need to eat slowly," he warned as he set the food down. "Your stomach will not be happy if you eat too fast." Grace stared at the food like it was treasure, but she nodded and picked up a small piece of jerky, chewing it slowly and deliberately. Zachary watched her for a moment and then scanned the camp. "Did you bury them? Your father and brother?" She shook her head. "It happened on the road about 5 miles north of here. I could not go back. I was too afraid the raiders might return, and I could not move them by myself anyway." Her voice was thick with shame and grief. "That is not your fault." Zachary kept his voice firm. "You survived. That is what they would have wanted." "Is it?" Grace looked up at him, and there was such raw pain in her eyes that he had to resist the urge to look away. "Or would they have wanted me to die with them? At least then we would all be together." No father wants his daughter to die. No brother wants that for his sister. Zachary sat down in the dirt across from her, settling in like he had all the time in the world, even though the sun was getting lower, and he knew they needed to make a decision soon about shelter. They would want you to live, to have the life they were trying to get to. Grace ate another small piece of jerky, chewing thoughtfully. "What life? I have nothing now. No family, no money, no supplies. I cannot even give them a proper burial." "We can fix one of those things right now." Zachary made the decision quickly, the way he always did when something felt right in his gut. "Tomorrow morning, you show me where they are and we will bury them proper, then I take you into Panamint. There are good people there. Someone will need help, and you can work until you get on your feet." "Why would you help me?" Grace set down the jerky, studying him with those pale green eyes. "You do not know me. I could be a liar. I could be anything." "Could be," Zachary agreed, "but I do not think you are. And even if you were, I still could not leave you here to starve." He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, suddenly feeling every one of his 32 years. "Look, I am not a complicated man. I work cattle. I keep my word, and I help people when I can. Right now, you need help. That is all the reason I need." For the first time since he had found her, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched Grace's lips. "You are either a very good man or a very foolish one." "Probably a bit of both." Zachary grinned, and the tension in the air eased slightly. "But I'm also a practical one, and it is going to be dark soon. There is a building over there that looks like it still has most of its roof. We should set up camp inside, get a fire going. It gets cold out here at night." Grace nodded and started to stand, but her legs buckled immediately. Zachary caught her before she hit the ground, and he was shocked at how light she was, like she was made of nothing but hollow bones and will. "Easy," he said gently. 4 days without food will do that. Let me help you." She leaned on him heavily as they made their way to the building he had indicated, a former assayer's office that still had 3 walls and most of a roof intact. Zachary got her settled on the cleanest spot he could find, then went back for his horse and her collection of cans, which she had insisted on bringing. By the time he had everything inside and a fire going in the old stone fireplace, full darkness had fallen, and the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. Grace was sitting close to the fire, still nibbling slowly on the food he had given her. The firelight softened the harsh edges of hunger on her face, and Zachary found himself wondering what she had looked like a month ago before tragedy had stripped everything away from her. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing. Just thinking." He settled down on the opposite side of the fire, respecting the unspoken boundaries that existed between strangers. "Tell me about your father and brother. What were they like?" Grace was quiet for so long that Zachary thought she might not answer, but then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. My father was a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity, the next fresh start. We lived in Kansas before this. He tried farming, but the grasshoppers came 3 years running and destroyed everything. Before that, we were in Missouri. He tried running a general store, but a bigger outfit moved in and undercut his prices until we had to close. She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. My mother died when I was 12. Fever. After that, it was just the 3 of us. Your brother was 16. You said? Yes, Thomas. Her voice softened when she said his name. He was a good kid, smart. He wanted to be a teacher someday, but father needed him too much. He never complained, though. He just helped however he could and read every book he could get his hands on when there was time. She wiped at her eyes quickly. He taught me to read properly. Father could manage basics, but Tommy loved words. He would have liked you bringing me those cans to read. Zachary felt the weight of her loss settling in the space between them. How old are you, Grace? 24. You? 32. Old enough to know better, young enough to still be stupid sometimes. He smiled slightly. I have worked ranches since I was 14. Started as a horse handler, worked my way up. The spread I am at now, the Broken Creek Ranch, I've been there for 6 years. Owner is a man named Dutch Herman. He is fair, works hard, treats his hands decent. It is a good place. Do you have family? Grace asked, turning the questions back on him. Not anymore. My mother died giving birth to a stillborn sister when I was 8. My father raised me until I was 12, then got kicked in the head by a horse and died 2 days later. Been on my own since then. He said it without emotion. Old grief that had been worn smooth by time. Made me independent, I guess. Maybe that is why I wander sometimes when I should not. Dutch was annoyed I went after that steer alone, but I like the solitude. And now you are stuck with me instead, Grace said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, just statement of fact. I do not consider it stuck. Zachary met her eyes across the fire. I consider it lucky that I found you when I did. Another day or two and... He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Grace pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. I should thank you properly for the food, the water, for not riding past me like I was just another piece of desert trash. Thank you, Zachary Zane. You are welcome, Grace Jensen. He stood up and pulled his bedroll from his pack. You should try to sleep. Tomorrow will be hard, but we will get through it. I will keep the fire going and stay over here. You will be safe, I promise. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words, then nodded and curled up close to the fire, using her arms as a pillow. Zachary spread his bedroll on the opposite side and lay down, staring up at the gaps in the roof where stars were visible. He listened to Grace's breathing slowly even out into sleep, and he thought about fate and chance, and how a man tracking a stray steer could end up being the difference between life and death for someone he had never met before. The desert night was full of sounds. The scurrying of small creatures and the distant howl of coyotes, but inside their shelter the fire crackled steadily and kept the darkness at bay. Morning came cold and clear, the sun rising over the mountains to the east and painting the world in shades of gold. Zachary woke to find Grace already awake, sitting by the dead fire and holding one of her cans, a rusted thing that had once held tomatoes. She was not reading the label this time, just holding it and staring at nothing. Morning, he said quietly, not wanting to startle her out of whatever thoughts she was lost in. She blinked and focused on him. Good morning. I hope you do not mind, but I drank some water from your canteen, just a little. That is what it is there for. He sat up and stretched, working the stiffness out of his shoulders. How are you feeling? Weak, but better than yesterday. She set the can down carefully with the others. I am ready to go if you are. To find them. Zachary nodded and began packing up their camp. He gave Grace more food, insisting she eat before they left, and refilled his canteen from the larger water skin on his horse. By the time the sun was fully up, they were ready to go. Grace rode in front of him on his horse, too weak to walk far, and she directed him north along the road. They rode in silence for the most part, and Zachary could feel the tension building in her body as they got closer. After about an hour, she held up her hand. "There," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "in that draw off to the right." Zachary guided the horse off the road and down into a shallow ravine. The scene was not hard to find. Buzzards had been at work, and Zachary felt his jaw tighten in anger and sorrow at what had been done here. 2 bodies lay where they had fallen, already starting to be reclaimed by the desert. Grace made a sound that was half sob, half keen, and Zachary helped her down from the horse quickly. "You do not have to watch," he said gently. "I can do this." But Grace shook her head. "No, I need to be here. I need to help." So they worked together in the growing heat. Zachary had a small folding shovel on his saddle, and they took turns digging in the hard desert ground. Grace could not do much. Her strength still depleted, but she insisted on helping. They dug 2 graves side by side, and Zachary tried to preserve what dignity he could as he moved the bodies. Grace had brought her father's hat and her brother's book, things the raiders had not bothered to take, and she placed them in the graves before they filled them in. When it was done, they stood before the 2 mounds of earth and rock, and Grace spoke quietly. "Thomas Peter Jensen, aged 16. He was kind and smart, and he deserved so much more than this." Her voice cracked. "Henry James Jensen, aged 48. He loved his family and tried his best always. May they rest in peace together." Zachary stood with his hat in his hands and said his own silent prayer, though he had never been a particularly religious man. When Grace finally turned away, her face was wet with tears, but her expression was resolute. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me do this, for letting me say goodbye properly." "Where are you headed now?" Zachary asked, though he already knew the answer. "Panamint, I suppose. It is where we were going. It seems right to finish the journey." She looked down at her hands, still dirty from digging, "Though I have no idea what I will do when I get there." "You will figure it out." Zachary put his hat back on and helped her back onto the horse. "And you will not be alone. I will make sure of that." They reached Panamint by late afternoon, riding into the bustling mining town that had sprung up around the discovery of silver in the Panamint Range. The main street was crowded with miners, merchants, gamblers, and all the various people who appeared wherever there was money to be made. Zachary could feel Grace tensing up behind him as they navigated through the crowds, and he understood. After what she had been through, this many people in one place must feel overwhelming. He stopped in front of a neat white building with a sign that read Mrs. Harriet Quinn's boarding house. Zachary had stayed here a few times when business brought him to town, and he knew the owner to be a practical woman with a good heart buried under a gruff exterior. "Wait here," he told Grace, helping her down from the horse. He went inside and found Mrs. Quinn behind her desk, a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Zachary Zane," she said, looking up from her ledger. "Did not expect to see you in town. You need a room?" "Not for me, for a young woman who needs help." He explained the situation quickly and directly, leaving out nothing important. Mrs. Quinn listened without interrupting, her expression growing more sympathetic as he spoke. "Bring her in," she said when he finished. "Poor child, she can stay here and I will not charge her rent until she gets on her feet. I can use help around here anyway. My last girl ran off with a gambler 3 weeks ago." Zachary felt relief wash over him. "Thank you, Harriet. I knew you would help." "Do not go thinking I'm soft," Mrs. Quinn warned, but her eyes were kind. "I expect hard work, and I do not tolerate any nonsense, but I take care of my girls. And it sounds like this one has been through enough." Zachary went back outside and found Grace exactly where he had left her, looking small and lost amid the bustle of the street. "Come on," he said gently. "I found you a place to stay." He introduced them, and Mrs. Quinn looked Grace over with a practiced eye. First thing, you need a bath and a proper meal. Then we will get you some decent clothes. Those rags will not do. She softened her tone slightly. You are safe here, girl. Nobody will hurt you under my roof. Grace's eyes filled with tears again. I do not have any money to pay you. Did not ask for any, did I? You will work for your keep until you can do better. Now come along. Mrs. Quinn took Grace by the arm, surprisingly gentle for such a brisk woman, and started leading her inside. Grace looked back at Zachary, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Will I see you again? She asked. Yes, he heard himself say without thinking. I will check on you in a few days, make sure you are settling in all right. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her gaunt face into something genuinely beautiful. And then Mrs. Quinn was pulling her inside and the door was closing behind them. Zachary stood in the street for a long moment, wondering what exactly he had just gotten himself into. He should ride back to the ranch, report in, get back to his regular work. Dutch would be wondering where he was. But something kept him rooted to the spot, staring at the door Grace had disappeared through. Finally, he shook himself and mounted his horse. He had promised to check on her, and he would keep that promise. For now, that was enough. The ride back to Broken Creek Ranch took him the rest of the evening, and he arrived just as the hands were finishing dinner. Dutch Herman was waiting for him by the barn, a tall man in his 50s with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. You found the steer? Dutch asked without preamble. No, sir. I found something else instead. Zachary dismounted and began unsaddling his horse while he told Dutch the whole story. The ranch owner listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when Zachary finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You did the right thing, Dutch finally said, though next time send word so I do not think you fell down a ravine somewhere. He clapped Zachary on the shoulder. Get some food and rest. We have work in the morning. That night, lying in his bunk in the ranch hand's quarters, Zachary found himself thinking about pale green eyes and a woman so hungry she had resorted to reading labels on empty cans to remember what being full felt like. He thought about her smile when he had promised to return, and he realized with a start that he was actually looking forward to going back to Panamint in a few days. He told himself it was just to check on her, to make sure Mrs. Quinn was treating her well, but deep down he knew it was more than that. Something about Grace Jensen had gotten under his skin, some combination of her strength and vulnerability that called to something in him he had thought long dead. Sleep was a long time coming. 3 days later, Zachary found himself riding back to Panamint with a legitimate excuse, a message to deliver to the assayer about a sample of ore Dutch wanted tested. He took care of the business first, not wanting to admit even to himself how eager he was to see Grace again, and then he walked slowly toward Mrs. Quinn's boarding house. The afternoon was hot, the desert sun beating down mercilessly, and Panamint was quieter than it had been on his last visit. He found Grace on the front porch of the boarding house, sweeping with steady, methodical strokes. She wore a simple blue dress that actually fit her, and her hair was clean and braided neatly down her back. She had gained a little weight already, her face not quite so gaunt, and she looked up as he approached. Recognition and pleasure flashed across her face, and Zachary felt something warm bloom in his chest at that look. Zachary, she said, setting the broom aside, you came back. Said I would. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly feeling awkward. How are you doing? Better. Much better. Grace came down the steps to stand closer to him. Mrs. Quinn is strict but fair, exactly as you said. I help with the cleaning and cooking, and she is teaching me how to keep the books. She says I have a head for numbers. That is good. I'm glad it is working out. Zachary found himself noticing details about her he had been too worried to see before. The way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. The graceful way she moved despite the lingering weakness in her frame. You look better. Healthier. I feel more human, Grace admitted. It is amazing what regular food and a safe place to sleep will do. She studied him for a moment. Did you come all this way just to check on me? I had business in town, he said, which was true, but not the whole truth. But yes, I wanted to see how you were doing. Grace's smile widened. Would you like to come in? I can make coffee. Mrs. Quinn is out visiting a friend, so I'm minding the house. Zachary knew he should say no, should get back on his horse and ride back to the ranch, but instead he found himself nodding and following her inside. The boarding house was neat and well kept, with a homey feel that spoke of a woman who took pride in her establishment. Grace led him to the kitchen and busied herself making coffee while he sat at the scarred wooden table. I think about them every day, Grace said suddenly, her back still to him as she worked. My father and brother. But it does not hurt quite so much as it did. Is that wrong? Should I be grieving more? Grief is not about how much you hurt, Zachary said carefully. It is about carrying the people you lost with you as you keep living. That is what honors them, not tearing yourself apart. Grace turned to look at him, coffee pot in hand, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You understand. Most people, they tell me to pray or to forget or to move on. Like grief is something you can just set down and walk away from. But you understand. I lost my parents young, Zachary reminded her. I know what it feels like to carry that weight. It gets easier, but it never really goes away. You just get stronger at carrying it. She poured the coffee and brought 2 cups to the table, sitting across from him. Tell me about the ranch. What is it like there? So Zachary told her about Broken Creek, about the wide open spaces and the hard work and the satisfaction of a job well done. He told her about Dutch and the other hands, about the cattle drives and the roundups and the simple rhythm of ranch life. Grace listened intently, asking questions, and he found himself talking more than he usually did, drawn out by her genuine interest. It sounds peaceful, she said when he finally wound down. Hard, but peaceful. It is. Zachary looked down at his coffee cup, swirling the dark liquid. You should visit sometime. Dutch does not mind visitors, and his wife Clara would like you. She is always complaining there are not enough women around to talk to. I would like that, Grace said softly. Though I do not know when I could get away. Mrs. Quinn depends on me. Maybe in a few weeks, when you are more settled. Zachary finished his coffee and stood, knowing he had already stayed longer than he should. I should get going. Long ride back. Grace walked him to the door, and on the porch she touched his arm lightly. Thank you again, Zachary, for everything. You saved my life. You saved your own life, he corrected gently. I just gave you a little help along the way. Still. She squeezed his arm once before letting go. Will you come back? Yes. He said it with certainty because it was the truth. He would come back. He could not stay away now if he tried. When I am in town again. He rode away from Panamint with the feeling of her hand on his arm still warm on his skin, and he knew with absolute certainty that something had changed in him. Grace Jensen was not just someone he had helped anymore. She was becoming important to him in a way that both excited and terrified him. Over the next several weeks, Zachary found reasons to go to Panamint more often than he ever had before. Dutch teased him about it good-naturedly, but did not object, especially since Zachary always came back with his work done and his spirits high. Each time he visited, Grace looked healthier and more confident, blooming like a desert flower after rain. They fell into an easy friendship, talking for hours when he visited, walking through town together, sharing meals at the boarding house when Mrs. Quinn allowed it. Zachary learned that Grace had a quick wit and a generous heart, that she loved books and music, and had a dream of one day owning her own restaurant. Grace learned that Zachary was quieter than he seemed, that he had a dry sense of humor, and that under his practical exterior was a man who felt things deeply but expressed them rarely. It was Clara Herman, Dutch's wife, who finally pointed out what should have been obvious to Zachary all along. He had brought Grace out to the ranch for a visit, and the two women had taken to each other immediately. After dinner, when Grace was helping with the dishes, Clara pulled Zachary aside on the porch. "You are in love with her," Clara said bluntly. She was a handsome woman in her 40s with kind eyes and no patience for foolishness. Zachary started to deny it. then stopped. Is it that obvious? To everyone but apparently you two. Clara shook her head fondly. The way you look at her. The way she lights up when you arrive. You should tell her, Zachary. Life is too short and too uncertain in this country to waste time dancing around feelings. What if she does not feel the same way? The vulnerability in his own voice surprised him. Oh, she does. Clara patted his arm. Trust me on this. But she will not say anything first. She still sees herself as someone you rescued, someone in your debt. You need to make the first move and show her this is about more than obligation. That night, riding back to Panamint with Grace sitting behind him on the horse, her arms around his waist for balance, Zachary tried to find the courage Clara seemed to think he possessed. The moon was full, lighting the desert in silver, and Grace was quiet behind him, lost in her own thoughts. Did you have a good time today? He asked, breaking the comfortable silence. I did. Clara is wonderful, and the ranch is beautiful. Thank you for inviting me. Grace rested her cheek against his back for just a moment before straightening again. It must be nice having a place like that to call home. It is not really mine, Zachary pointed out. I just work there. But you belong there. That is different from just working somewhere. You have people who care about you, a place where you fit. There was wistfulness in her voice. I have not had that in a long time. Since before my mother died, really. After that, it was always temporary stops, always getting ready to move on to the next thing. Zachary made a decision, his heart pounding. Grace, I need to tell you something. All right. Her arms tightened slightly around him. These past weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, it has been the best part of my days. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, afraid if he looked at her, he would lose his nerve. You are not just someone I helped anymore. You are someone I care about, someone important to me. I think I'm falling in love with you, and I needed you to know that. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Then Grace said quietly, Stop the horse. Zachary's heart sank, certain he had ruined everything, but he pulled the horse to a stop. Grace slid down and walked a few steps away, her back to him. He dismounted and went to her, preparing himself for rejection. Grace, I am sorry if I overstepped. She turned suddenly, and the words died in his throat because she was smiling, tears streaming down her face in the moonlight. I have been falling in love with you since the day you found me, she said, her voice shaking. But I was so afraid to say anything. I thought maybe you just felt responsible for me or guilty, or that you were just being kind. I am not that kind, Zachary said, and then he was closing the distance between them and cupping her face in his hands. I am falling in love with you because you are strong and brave and kind and beautiful, because talking to you feels like coming home, because I cannot imagine my life now without you in it. Zachary, she whispered, and then she was kissing him. Or he was kissing her, or they were kissing each other, and it did not matter who started it because it felt perfect and right and like something that had been inevitable from the moment he had found her reading labels on empty cans. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grace laughed, and it was the most joyful sound Zachary had ever heard. What do we do now? She asked. Just now? Zachary grinned. Now I court you properly. I take you to dinner. I bring you flowers. I ask permission from Mrs. Quinn to spend time with you. We do this right. I would like that, Grace said, and kissed him again. The courtship that followed was sweet and slow and everything either of them could have wanted. Zachary did bring flowers, wild flowers he picked from the desert on his rides to town. He did take her to dinner at the nicest restaurant Panamint had to offer. They went to church socials together and on long walks through the hills around town. Mrs. Quinn watched over them like a hawk, determined to protect Grace's reputation, but she approved of the match and said so often. 3 months after that moonlit confession, Zachary asked Grace to marry him. He did it simply, without fancy words or grand gestures, just the two of them sitting on the porch of the boarding house watching the sunset. I want to spend my life with you, he said, holding her hand. "I want to build something together. A home, a family, a future. Will you marry me, Grace Jensen?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 6 weeks later in Panamin's small church, with Mrs. Quinn and Dutch and Clara standing up for them and most of the town in attendance. Grace wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Quinn had helped her sew, and Zachary wore his best suit and could not stop smiling. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed his bride and felt like the luckiest man in California. Dutch had offered them a small house on the ranch property, one of the line shacks that had been fixed up and expanded, and that became their first home together. It was modest but comfortable, and Grace set about making it truly theirs with curtains she sewed and furniture they bought or built together. Zachary taught her to ride properly, and Grace taught him to appreciate books and music. They worked hard during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal passion. A year into their marriage, Grace announced she was pregnant. Zachary whooped with joy and spun her around the kitchen, and that night they lay in bed planning names and future and all the things their child would be and do. "Boy or girl, it does not matter," Zachary said, his hand spread protectively over Grace's still flat stomach, "as long as they are healthy and happy." "A boy," Grace said confidently. "I can feel it. A boy with your eyes and my stubbornness." She was right. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, a healthy baby with a strong cry and his father's dark hair. They named him Thomas Henry Zane, for the brother and father Grace had lost, and when she held him for the first time, she cried tears of both joy and sorrow. "They would have loved him," she whispered to Zachary as he held them both. "They do love him," Zachary said firmly. "Wherever they are, they see him and they love him." Parenthood suited them both. Zachary was patient and playful with his son, teaching him everything about ranch life as soon as the boy could walk. Grace was loving and firm, determined that Thomas would grow up knowing his own worth and the value of kindness. She also began cooking meals for the ranch hands, discovering she had a real talent for feeding large groups, and her meals became legendary among the crew. 3 years after Thomas was born, Grace gave birth to twin daughters, identical girls with their mother's pale green eyes and their father's smile. They named them Sarah and Catherine, and the house that had seemed cozy for 3 now felt bursting with 5. Dutch offered them a larger house, one of the homes closer to the main ranch buildings, and they accepted gratefully. Life settled into a rhythm that was busy but fulfilling. Zachary had been promoted to foreman, in charge of managing the other hands and overseeing the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Grace started her restaurant dream, not in a town but right there on the ranch, cooking for the hands and for travelers passing through. Dutch helped her convert one of the outbuildings into a proper kitchen and dining area, and soon people were making special trips to Broken Creek Ranch just to taste Grace's cooking. The children grew. Thomas proved to be as book smart as his uncle had been, but he also loved ranch work and had a way with horses that reminded everyone of his father. Sarah was the quieter twin, thoughtful and artistic, always drawing or painting what she saw. Catherine was bold and fearless, climbing trees and riding horses before she was supposed to and generally giving her parents gray hairs. 5 years after the twins were born, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was another girl, Rose, who came into the world during a desert thunderstorm as if announcing she would always be dramatic. Rose had her mother's dark hair and her father's easy nature, and she was doted on by her older siblings. Through it all, through the good years and the lean ones, through cattle drives and droughts and the endless work of ranch life, Zachary and Grace's love only deepened. They still walked together in the evenings when they could, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still looked at each other with the same wonder they had felt that first night under the moon. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary surprised Grace with a trip to San Francisco. Dutch and Clara watched the children, And for 1 week, Zachary and Grace were just a couple again. Not parents or workers, just two people in love, exploring a city neither had ever seen before. On their last night there, sitting at a fancy restaurant overlooking the bay, Grace reached across the table and took Zachary's hand. "Do you remember the day you found me?" she asked. "Of course. How could I forget? I was so close to giving up." Grace's eyes were distant, remembering. "I had decided that day was probably my last. I would fall asleep reading those labels and just not wake up. It seemed easier than trying to survive." She focused on him, and her eyes were full of love and gratitude. "And then you appeared, like something out of a story, a cowboy on a horse who decided to care about a starving stranger." "Best decision I ever made," Zachary said, meaning every word. "Mine too, choosing to trust you, to accept your help, to let myself love you." Grace squeezed his hand. "I was so empty that day, reading labels and trying to remember what full felt like. And now look at us. Look at our life. I am so full I could burst with it sometimes. Full of love, full of family, full of purpose and joy, and all the things I thought I would never have again." Zachary raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You deserve it all. You deserve everything good in this world." "We deserve it," Grace corrected, "together." They returned home to children who had missed them and a ranch that needed them. And life went on in all its beautiful, messy, wonderful complexity. The years passed with the relentless march they always do. Thomas grew into a fine young man, responsible and kind, who took over more and more of the ranch duties from his father. At 20, he married a local girl named Emma, and they settled in a house at the far end of the ranch property. The twins grew into beautiful young women. Sarah became a teacher, opening a small school on the ranch for the workers' children and any others in the area. Catherine married a neighboring rancher's son and moved 30 miles away, close enough to visit often, but far enough to feel independent. Rose, the baby, surprised everyone by declaring at 16 that she wanted to study medicine, and Zachary and Grace worked hard to save enough to send her to a proper school. Dutch Herman passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1899, and Clara followed him less than a year later, dying of a broken heart according to those who knew them best. In his will, Dutch left the Broken Creek Ranch to Zachary, who had been like a son to him. Zachary wept when the lawyer read the will, and that night he held Grace close and said, "I never imagined I would own land. Never dreamed I could have something like this to pass down to our children." "You earned it," Grace said firmly. With years of hard work and loyalty, Dutch knew what he was doing. As the new century dawned, Zachary and Grace found themselves grandparents multiple times over. Thomas and Emma had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Catherine had 3 sons in quick succession, much to her amused exasperation. Even Sarah, who everyone thought would remain an old maid school teacher, fell in love with a widower passing through and ended up with an instant family of his 2 daughters, plus 3 more children they had together. Rose did become a doctor, one of the first women to do so in California, and she set up her practice in Panamint, coming home to the ranch often to treat workers and their families. She never married, declaring she was married to her work, but she seemed happy and fulfilled in a way that made her parents proud. Zachary's hair turned silver and his face grew more weathered, but he still rode every day and oversaw the ranch with the same careful attention he always had. Grace's dark hair showed threads of white, and her figure had filled out comfortably with age, but her eyes were still that striking pale green, and her smile still lit up Zachary's world every single time. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. The whole ranch turned out, plus friends from Panamint and the surrounding ranches, people whose lives Zachary and Grace had touched over the decades. There was food and music and dancing, and Zachary led Grace in a waltz while their children and grandchildren watched and applauded. 30 years, Grace said, resting her head on Zachary's shoulder as they swayed to the music. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we met, and sometimes it feels like I have known you my whole life. Both are true, I think, Zachary said. Time is funny that way. Do you ever think about how different things could have been if you had ridden past that mining camp, if you had not stopped? Grace looked up at him. I think about it sometimes, Zachary admitted. And then I thank God I did stop, that I found you, that you gave me a chance. We gave each other chances, Grace corrected gently. You could have just left me in Panamint and never looked back, but you kept coming back. You chose me even when I had nothing to offer but myself. That was everything, Zachary said, and kissed her forehead. You were everything. The party continued late into the night with stories and laughter and the kind of joy that comes from a life well lived and love well tended. When everyone had finally gone home or to bed, Zachary and Grace stood on the porch of their home, the same porch where they had spent countless evenings over the years, and looked out at the ranch that had become their kingdom. Do you remember what I said that first day? Grace asked, about remembering what full felt like. I remember. I was so empty then, hollow, desperate. Grace leaned into Zachary's side and he wrapped his arm around her. And now, standing here with you, with our children grown and happy, with grandchildren carrying on our name, with this life we built together, I cannot imagine being more full. My cup does not just overflow, Zachary. It floods. Mine too, Zachary said softly. Mine too. They stood there in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other when both needed finding, who had built a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger, who had created a legacy that would outlast them both. More years rolled past like tumbleweed across the desert. Zachary stepped back from active management of the ranch when he turned 70, handing over the reins to Thomas, who had proven himself more than capable. But Zachary still rode out most days, checking on this or that, unable to fully retire from the work that had defined so much of his life. Grace finally got her own restaurant, though not in the way she had once imagined. Rose, who had made a success of her medical practice, convinced Grace to open a small cafe in Panamint, and at 60 years old, Grace found herself starting a new adventure. The cafe became the heart of the town, a place where everyone gathered for good food and better company, and Grace presided over it with warmth and skill. They split their time between the ranch and Panamint, sometimes staying at the cafe for weeks at a time, sometimes spending long stretches back home with their ever-expanding family. They had 14 grandchildren at last count, and the first great-grandchildren were starting to arrive, babies that Zachary could barely believe existed. We started a dynasty, he told Grace one night, holding their newest great-grandson, a squirming bundle named Zachary Thomas, after him. We started a family, Grace corrected. That is better than any dynasty. Time, which had seemed to move so slowly in those early desperate days, now seemed to race past. Before Zachary knew it, he was 75, then 80, then 85. Grace was 77. And though both of them had slowed down considerably, their minds were still sharp and their love still fierce. They closed the cafe when Grace turned 75, deciding it was finally time to truly rest. They moved permanently back to the ranch, to the home they had raised their children in, and settled into a gentle routine. Mornings on the porch with coffee, afternoons reading or receiving visitors, evenings watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Rose visited often, checking on their health with a physician's eye and a daughter's heart. Thomas ran the ranch with his own children, helping now the fourth generation to work this land. The other children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren came and went in a steady stream, filling the house with noise and life. On a warm spring evening in 1916, Zachary and Grace sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Zachary was 88 now, his body failing in ways that frustrated him even as he accepted them. Grace was 80, still beautiful to him despite the ravages of time. "Do you have any regrets?" Zachary asked suddenly. It was a question he had never asked before, perhaps afraid of the answer. Grace thought for a long moment. "I regret that my father and brother never got to know you, never got to see what I built, what we built. I regret that they died so young, so senselessly. She paused. But I do not regret anything about our life together. Not one moment. Even the hard times, the times we struggled or fought or worried about money or children or any of the thousand things that make up a life. I do not regret any of it. Neither do I, Zachary said. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Zane. And you to me, Zachary Zane. They held hands as the sun set. Two old people who had loved each other well and truly, who had faced everything life threw at them and come through together. Zachary passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, his heart simply wearing out after 88 years of steady beating. Grace held his hand as he slipped away, and her last words to him were, "I will find you again. Wherever you go, I will follow." The funeral was enormous, with people coming from all over California to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and kindness. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he had picked out years before under a large oak tree that provided shade even in the hottest summer. Grace lived for 2 more years after Zachary's death, and while she remained active and engaged with her family, everyone could see that part of her had gone with her husband. She spent hours sitting by his grave, talking to him, telling him about the great-great-grandchild who had just been born, about how the ranch was doing, about all the little details of life he was missing. On a cool morning in early November 1918, Grace woke feeling unusually peaceful. She had breakfast with Rose, who was staying with her, and then announced she wanted to visit Zachary's grave. Rose went with her, concerned by something in her mother's manner. They sat under the oak tree, and Grace talked to Zachary, as she always did, filling him in on family news. Then she turned to Rose and smiled. "You have been such a good daughter," Grace said. "All my children have been blessings, but you stayed close even when your life pulled you elsewhere. Thank you for that." "Mama, you are scaring me," Rose said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I feel wonderful," Grace said truthfully. "Better than I have in a long time." She looked out over the ranch, the home that had held her life for so many years. "You know, when your father found me, I was reading labels on empty cans trying to remember what full felt like. I was so empty then, so lost and alone, and convinced I would die that way." "But you did not," Rose said, taking her mother's hand. "Papa found you." "He did, and he filled me up, Rose, not just with food that first day, though that was important, but with love, with purpose, with family and home and all the things that make life worth living. He filled me up until I overflowed, and that overflow created all of you and your children, and their children. That one cowboy stopping for one starving girl created all of this." Grace gestured at the ranch spread out before them. "Mama, I am ready," Grace said gently. "I have lived a full life, the fullest life anyone could ask for. But I miss your father. I am ready to go to him." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "Please do not talk like that." But Grace just smiled and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Take care of them all. Remind them that love is what matters, that family is what matters. The land and the money and all the rest of it, that is just dressing. Love is what fills us up and makes us whole." They sat together for another hour, mother and daughter, under the oak tree that sheltered Zachary's grave. When they finally stood to go back to the house, Grace swayed slightly and Rose caught her. "I'm just tired," Grace said. "Help me inside?" Rose got her mother to bed, tucking her in like Grace had once tucked in all her children. Grace closed her eyes and smiled, and Rose sat beside her holding her hand. Grace never woke up. She slipped away sometime in the night, as peacefully as Zachary had, and when Rose found her in the morning, there was a smile on her face that Rose recognized. It was the smile her mother always wore when looking at her father. They buried Grace next to Zachary under the oak tree, and if the family cried, they also celebrated 2 lives extraordinarily well lived. Thomas spoke at the funeral, standing before the assembled crowd of family and friends. "My parents taught me that love is a choice you make every day," he said, his voice strong despite his grief. They chose each other every single day for over 30 years of marriage and 2 years of widowhood where my mother chose to honor my father's memory. They showed all of us what it means to build something lasting, something real. This ranch, our family, it all started because a cowboy stopped when he saw a woman in need. That one act of kindness rippled out into all of this. After the funeral, after the mourners had left and the family had dispersed, Rose walked up to the graves one last time. There were 2 headstones now side by side under the oak tree. Zachary's read, Zachary Zane, 1828-1916. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he lived with honor. Grace's read, Grace Zane, 1838-1918. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She remembered what full felt like. Rose touched both stones gently. Thank you, she whispered, for showing us how to love, for building something beautiful, for filling us all up with your love. The wind rustled through the oak leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. The ranch went on, as it always would, carrying forward the legacy of a cowboy and the woman he had found reading labels on empty cans, trying to remember what full felt like. Together they had found fullness, had created it and nurtured it and passed it on to everyone lucky enough to know them. Their love story had started with emptiness and ended with abundance, and everyone who came after them would carry forward that lesson, that we fill each other up, that love is what makes us whole, that one act of kindness can ripple forward through generations, creating waves of love and family and connection that never truly end. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management and eventually under his children and grandchildren. The house where Zachary and Grace had raised their family was preserved, kept exactly as they had left it, a museum of sorts for future generations to visit and understand where they came from. Children would walk through and see the simple furniture, the books Grace had loved, the saddle Zachary had used for 40 years, and they would hear the stories. They would hear about the day Zachary found Grace in that abandoned mining camp, about how she had been reading labels to remember what full felt like. They would hear about the courtship and the wedding and the building of a life together. They would hear about love that lasted through everything, that only grew stronger with time, that created a legacy far beyond what either Zachary or Grace could have imagined when they were young. And some of those children walking through that preserved house would understand on a deep level what their great-great-great-grandparents had known, that we are all empty sometimes, that we all need someone to stop and help us remember what full feels like, and that when we find that person, when we choose to fill each other up with love and kindness and commitment, we create something that outlasts us both. The story of Zachary and Grace became family legend, told and retold, embellished and preserved, a touchstone for everyone who came after. And if the details changed slightly with each telling, the heart of it remained the same. A cowboy had found a woman reading labels on empty cans. She had told him she was remembering what full felt like, and he had spent the rest of his life making sure she never felt empty again. It was a simple story, really, but the best love stories always are.